Welcome to the Subterranean Railroad, a podcast that guides fugitive slaves to freedom. I'm your host, Sean, and today I'm going to be answering the question that every fugitive slave asks. Where should I go?
I'm Patrick, and I'm going to be representing Canada.
I'm Hitesh, and I'm representing Philadelphia.
I'm Jaden, and I'm representing Baltimore.
I'm Ahmad, and I represent Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Sean, I'm going to be representing New York City.
Join us as we dive into the secret network of abolitionists, safe houses, and communities that provide refuge and support. From the bustling cities of the North to the remote settlements in Canada, let's uncover the paths to liberty and the destinations that offer hope to those seeking freedom.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for a captivating discussion on how we will change the life of Mary Johnson. But first, who is she, you may ask?
Mary Johnson is a 24-year-old woman who was freed in 1820 following her owner's death. Her husband, Marcus, remains enslaved on a neighboring farm, and they have a 7-year-old daughter, Eliza.
Alright, the Johnsons live near Easton, Maryland, with no debts and some savings from Marcus's carpentry work. They have relatives in Cambridge, many still enslaved on local farms. Mary, facing this dilemma, must decide where to go.
But despite Eliza still being a slave, Mary considers taking her daughter along. Marcus is willing to escape with her, believing in their chances.
When I was freed, I didn't realize the challenges and restrictions I'd face. I met this girl, Michelle, but my slave owner, Andrew, separated me from her, and I couldn't marry her.
Yeah, I think it's the same for both the South and the North in the Antebellum Period.
Alright, so now we're going to discuss about each of our states and where Mary should move to.
I have a question. Would Mary's husband, Marcus, who's still enslaved, move with her?
So we have to account for the ease of getting there with a fugitive slave.
Right, and considering Marcus and her daughter Eliza are still enslaved, they could be recaptured under the Fugitive Slave Act. That'd be trouble because Baltimore is a major city and it's in the same state.
With fugitive slave laws and bounty hunters, it would be difficult to move across borders with her husband. Alright, so I'm representing Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm going to explain to you why this is a good place for her. So the economic opportunities here and jobs and housing. You could work at the Charleston Navy Yard, which is where they helped fix ships, create ships, and kind of port them in this area. Jobs there were rope makers, carpenters, and ship riggers. And these are just like some of the employment opportunities at a certain place. And for housing, the north slope of Beacon Hill was a popular place where many free Africans lived. Average pricing for a house here was about $2,000 to $4,000. With a good career, you could probably afford that. In a social and political aspect, there were churches and societies like the African American Society on Beacon Hill, which helped create a community that talked about politics and discussed how to improve their society and influence others to create more Black institutions. Laws and court cases in Massachusetts regarding the status of formerly enslaved people. They were legally free since 1783, but they were still considered inferior to white Americans, but they were treated equally in court, which is a good thing. And in the case of Quack v. Walker, a slave sued his owner and won his freedom, and this made the steps towards abolishment of slavery. And the advantages and disadvantages of the life quality, there were Black communities with societies supported each other and their rights, but some downsides were that Africans were not considered equal though. They didn't have the right to vote. So that's my case for why she should move to Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah, so many African Americans in Boston were laborers, and the great thing about Boston is that slavery was actually abolished, as you said, in the 1780s. The housing's a bit expensive, but yeah.
It's affordable with the job.
While I see what you're saying with the jobs, are they actually available to women?
I got 100 on the assignment.
Looks like Mary's gonna be unemployed. So as you all know, in the 1800s, New York was growing like crazy. I mean, from the 1830s to 1840s, it doubled and increased by around 150,000 people. And more people equals more economic opportunities. So during the time, the ideas of liberty and equality from the Revolutionary War influenced northern attitudes towards slavery, though challenges like racial discrimination still persisted. So, formerly enslaved women, they were limited to roles like domestic servants, laundresses, housekeepers, and waitresses. However, Mary's husband Marcus could find work in various fields like construction, especially with his carpentry skills, which we discussed about earlier. So, women had less work opportunities than men, but still it was more than most of the other southern states. Alright, so now where are they gonna live? Free African Americans in New York were restricted to certain housing. They lived in the poorest, unhealthiest neighborhoods and were often harassed by whites. And since African Americans were less privileged, many couldn't own schools or have certain professions. That means Eliza is going to a white school. Another thing we have to consider is the Great Famine in Ireland. This occurred in the 1840s, and it was due to a failure of the potato crop. So what that did is bring millions of Irish Catholic immigrants to the US, which drove African Americans out of various jobs, but also whites too. Next up, despite the racial discriminations, New York was more liberal than the South, and some communities had a progressive atmosphere, as we were talking about the activism. They supported abolition, and Mary's family could connect with individuals that shared similar goals. As we all know, segregation was a big issue in New York. Though New York abolished slavery in 1827, black residents still faced considerable racial discrimination. So that could force Mary's family into low-paying and unskilled labor. But despite the challenges, free African American women in New York, such as Maria Stewart, were activists for education and equal rights. For example, they resisted slavery, oppression, and exploitation. One prominent person is Lily Ann Granson. She's known as the Midnight Teacher, but she was a slave who secretly educated hundreds of slaves in what she called the Midnight School. Another is Sojourner Truth. She was an ex-slave who fought for civil rights, women's rights, and escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826. And I think Mary can take some inspiration from her, considering she also has a daughter. So New York was a northern state, which meant the legal environment might be more favorable than southern states. So I think Mary should research specific laws and cases that free African Americans can use to assert their rights. Alright, so lastly, New York City's living conditions were not the best, and that was due to the immigration and the sheer population. Economically, while New York may be good for job opportunities, it might not be the best to raise a family. So the pros were the growing economy, the relatively progressive social movement, and the opportunities for jobs and the movement for abolition and activism. The cons, however, were the segregation, competition for jobs, and the poor living conditions. So that's why I think New York is a great place if she is interested in what it has to offer.
Now I'm going to tell you why Mary should move to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was known to have one of the highest economic opportunities for African Americans. Black men were easily able to find work, physical labor, but women could usually only become teachers, nurses. By the 1820s, some women were able to own their own businesses, but it was very rare. For housing, free African Americans could buy property. By the 1800s, there were many black communities developed in Philadelphia. You could find farmlands. For social and political opportunities, there were many societies founded by black people to aid other black people in poverty. Children's had education in Philadelphia. Black children. Black people were able to have a voice in legislative issues by reaching out to legislators, but they could not vote. There were also many black-owned churches. Black people had the freedom of religion. Laws that affected former slaves. The Gradual Abolition Act was passed, which would gradually get rid of slavery. All slaves would be free by 1840.
Right, and due to all those segregation issues, Philadelphia actually founded the first African American denomination in the US. It was known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, also known as the AME Church.
Another law was the Act to Prevent Kidnapping, Preserve the Public Peace, prohibit the exercise by certain judges, justices of the peace, aldermen, and jailers in this commonwealth. This was the act that got rid of slavery completely. Some pros about Pennsylvania was, again, slavery was abolished. There are, like I said, many job opportunities. Members could purchase property. Children's had education. There was slight participation in politics. Another important thing in Mary's situation is that families could not be separated because, Mary's husband is enslaved currently. Some cons were that even though there were many opportunities, most blacks in Philadelphia lived in poverty. Many encountered racism and segregation, especially in schools for children. They didn't have as much economic opportunity as whites or political opportunity because they couldn't vote.
Yeah, I think these places where slavery has been abolished should be held in high regard, because that's an important thing to keep in mind while choosing a place to stay.
Yeah, also the fact that their families can't be separated is a big deal for her because of her husband and her kid. So, Canada, in terms of slavery, is pretty cool. Slavery was abolished under the Slavery Abolition Act in 1834, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. And then after that was abolished, there was an abundance of economic opportunities, not just for men, but for women also. Men could partake in carpentry, manufacturing, they could own their own businesses, they could own their own land. A lot of them farmed. Women could be seamstresses or house workers, and a lot of free slaves then transitioned into becoming indentured servants because they had nowhere to work. So it would still allow them, even if they couldn't find a job, to have a way to get food and get paid, basically. So in addition to the economic opportunities, there was a lot of social and political advantages to black people. Many of the black people formed their own communities and settled down together in a supportive, inclusive community. They could not vote, but they could influence their local politicians. The one downside of their social status was that there was segregation in schools until 1850, so Eliza would grow up in a segregated school. Some pros and cons of Canada are the abolition of slavery in 1834. The fugitive slave laws that are in place in America don't apply to Canada, so if they were caught, they wouldn't be sent back. Her husband would also be free upon arrival to Canada. They could run their own businesses and shops, they could own land, and there were many more sympathetic people up in Canada than there are in the continental US.
So would you say Canada has more or less slavery than the northern states?
Not so much as the South, but there was subsistence farming.
So Canada might be a good option. Now we're going to move on to the final place, Maryland, and that's where we're currently living.
Alright, so Mary already lives in Maryland, so her going to Baltimore would take out the hassle of having to move away. Some economic opportunities is that both enslaved and free men could work as caulkers, painters, carvers, glazers, plumbers, sailmakers, and multiple other common labor jobs. However, women did not have any labor job opportunities, and for housing, black people were able to own property, and by 1856 there were 236 black property owners in Baltimore. For their social and political bonuses, they had organized 20 churches and founded more than 30 benevolent societies and established schools. Free blacks were also active in the Underground Railroad, helping slaves from Maryland's eastern shore gain safe passage to the north.
So one big problem for them living in Maryland at the time was the fugitive slave law, and that allowed slave owners to report runaways to authorities. And because Marcus and Eliza are both enslaved, that could put Mary at risk too into being recaptured.
Yeah.
They'd receive years in prison and heavy fines.
So some laws in Baltimore that they had was the Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation in all public facilities. And they implemented this in the 1870s. So if Mary, right, if she were to move to Baltimore, as her kid grew up and, as they got older and they maybe expanded their family, there would be more segregation in the 1870s.
I would just like to point out, they're moving there in the 1820s. The 1870s are a really long time away. They should be fine.
They should be fine for now, but
it is something.
if they decided to stay in Maryland.
So for a lot of the northern states, slavery died down after the 1800s. For example, New York ended on Independence Day in 1827, but what would you say about Maryland? Did slavery persist throughout the Antebellum Period and up to the Emancipation Proclamation?
Maryland didn't die down over time. I mean, probably after, as more abolitionists started to appear, because as I said, in the Jim Crow laws,
Slavery was abolished in 1864.
Right, so to wrap it up, I think we can take Maryland off the list, not just because of the economic conditions and Jim Crow laws, but for the safety of her children. That's because Baltimore is a major city, and if slave catchers find out about her daughter and husband, then that family is not having a happy ending.
Yeah, and that's why I think.
Yeah,
I was just about to say
Baltimore is not the best choice for them.
Yeah.
I think if they're gonna send out people looking for them, the first place they're gonna look is Baltimore. If that's where they decide to settle down, it would be a quick capture.
Yeah.
Disadvantages and advantages of the life quality team.
Advantages is, as I said, Marie's husband would have multiple labor job opportunities, and they would also be able to buy property. The black have a community. Eliza would be able to go to school. Some cons is that the Jim Crow laws, they would be safe for now, but Baltimore is close to where they were staying before. So they would probably check, looking for her husband, they would most likely check Baltimore first before anywhere, and then they would get caught.
I think Canada is a great option despite the extreme distance from Maryland to Canada. I think it's
Yeah.
Even
though it's going to take a long time, they're going to be free and they're going to have no chance of being sent back if they make it.
I'm gonna agree with the Tesh. Definitely follow the Underground Railroad, head to the northern states, and if that doesn't work, then Canada. And that way you'll avoid getting into danger and to have more opportunities.
But I feel like crossing the border, it may be a challenge, but it's also a sense of security because you've entered a new authority area. So ultimately, what would the best place be?
Canada.
Canada. If you can't make it to Canada, a good choice is Boston because it's similar, but there is more risk of her being there.
Alright, so thank you for watching today's episode of the Subterranean Railroad. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment below or send it to our inbox if you're a free slave struggling to find out where to live.
Bro, I'm getting thousands
And
of
subscribe
emails.
to Alpha MC on YouTube.
I'm getting DMs in my Instagram. I'm getting thousands of mails
I'm getting
sent to
people
my
quick
house.
adding me on Snap because they know
Yeah,
I'm
bro,
the
so
man.
subscribe.
We're gonna be dropping some new merch. That'll be coming soon. Keep
Content.
out.
Alpha
Keep a
MC
lookout for
merch.
that.
Check it out. AlphaMC.com, baby. Oh, my fault. AlphaMC.store.
Yes, sir.
Cut it. I don't even know what this fugitive slave law is, bro. I'm just copying this.
Lasers.
Lasers, bro.
Laser.
Lasers.
Dude, is that what it says?
Huh?
Yeah, it says Glazers. Oh shoot, no.
So, Jaden, the fugitive
I did
slave law
not
is
know,
basically
bro.
they have to be
I did
sent
not
back
know.
to the
Hold
spot.
on. I have to. Alright.
Are you ready?
Alright, tell me where I can go.
Yes, sir, Sean.
Because he's Mexican.
I think my side tricep is my best